guys, I've gotten a few hundred questions about my settings. I really do understand why you would ask about the settings, because I had the exact same feeling when I came into MIDI Guitar 2. Coming from being a standard guitar user, going into MIDI Guitar, I was just thinking, okay, I'm gonna use my regular guitar, I'm gonna use the same way of playing. I'm just gonna apply this software and out will come heaven and synth sounds and virtual instruments, and I can perhaps play an orchestra. And why wouldn't anybody have done this before? It wasn't as smooth a transition as I would have hoped. So the thing that you're asking me for are, of course, the best settings. And the best settings for what is my question, because the best settings depend on what playing style you're using, and the playing style is going to be dependent on how well you handle latency, for instance. The latency is a thing that you think would have anything to do with tracking, and then the tracking is of course determined by the best settings you're asking about. So this is sort of an endless circle. You tamper with some settings and then it will affect your playing style. So perhaps put up a noise gate too much, you take the edge of your ability to sort of use legato stuff. But my advice to you is to end this sort of endless circle. Set your mind to, okay, this will be a good enough setting to start using, and just jump into it. The thing that will help you initially or in the end is actually to play with this software, only using the instruments as the referential audio coming back to you. So you'll hear what comes out in the end. Don't use this together with your guitar sound to begin with. Say you use a piano. If you only use that piano output into your speakers, like the monitoring sounds that you'll hear, you'll also always going to hear, okay, so the latency is this and this much, I have to anticipate, it is what it is, and I know about it. The big difference for us is we're coming in from having played our guitars with the audio going direct out from our speakers, so we have this direct connection. And now we feel a disconnect because of the latency that's part of this actual process. You perhaps do best in start viewing your MIDI guitar experiences or experiments as a separate instrument and relearn the whole process together with those instruments you're trying to play. That was my way of getting past this. So I just loaded the instruments that I was interested in playing and played until I got, okay, so if I'm playing a Swam cello, it's not going to be exactly as fast as perhaps a piano or even the Swam soprano sax. There are individual differences in all the instruments, and I must know about them when I play. Some instruments, some virtual instruments play really, really good on even the softest dynamic levels. You have the sample modeling trumpet, that's a beautiful example of that. I can't feel any sort of disconnect from the latency that I know is there with some instruments, but some other really sort of accentuate or amplify that sort of disconnect more. So it's very much a question of what instruments do you choose. You have to choose the right instrument for your experiments as well. So instrument choice is important. A new mindset is equally as important. I wouldn't recommend you go into this and say that, okay, it's the software's fault that I can't play this stuff. Stuff like that takes time. This is a new instrument. It does take time. From when I started putting up YouTube videos on MIDI guitar, I've gotten this question: what are your settings? I can't get the same results as you. What am I doing wrong? And my guess is you're probably not doing anything wrong at all with the settings. We all had the same sort of problems coming into MIDI guitar. So if you're new to this, look at this walkthrough and try to experiment with all the settings one at a time. This is kind of important for you to actually hear what that particular setting does for the note translation, because there is no button in the software that says tracking good and bad, and you can sort of tune to a better tracking that way. You have to know exactly what it is you're putting in and what the software does with what you're putting in relation to that. So if the only thing you want is my settings as I'm using them, I have latency at 128 at 44.1 kilohertz. I have input gain at 0 or 1. I have noise gate probably at 0, could be 1 as well. And I have all the 3 knobs in the MIDI Velocity box at 12 o'clock to begin with usually. I will go over what each of these would mean for the tracking and the dynamics parts now. In the left corner you have an interface button. Once you click that, you see a slot called latency, and that's where you make your choice. And you might think, okay, I would rather have the least amount of latency possible, of course. That would be natural, but there's sort of a weighing you have to do, because the least amount of latency you can have also puts the greatest amount of stress on your computer. So you have to weigh in, is that so much of a gain so that I want to use that alternative? The least amount that you can use or choose from the MIDI Guitar 2 software is the 64 samples at whatever sample rate you are using with your audio interface. If it's 44.1 or 48 kilohertz, I guess you wouldn't be able to distinguish any audible difference, but that's up to you to decide. But before we leave the audio interface box, let's look at the input gain here. This is one of the settings where I recommend you use 1. Let's go back to the MIDI guitar view here and see what the help section says about this. As with all music gear, it's vital that you adjust your input gain. Please do it now. If your audio interface has an input gain control, use it to set the level and leave the knob here in the mid position. For me, that would be here. I, on the other hand, want to have it at 0 or 1 and control the rest on the audio interface. This is something you're gonna have to look at for yourselves, where you want to put this input gain meter, because you're probably not going to use it more than once. You're going to set a value and then you're going to work with that. You're going to close the interface and forget that it's there. So be really mindful of what setting you use to begin with. The next part is the noise gate, where I also suggest you don't actually use it, since if you use a noise gate to hopefully take away those notes that you wouldn't want to be played, you just can't decide what notes you've actually managed not to play in relation to those notes that the software sort of helped you not to play. You see already here that my legato game is compromised. So having the noise gate at 50% would be detrimental for my playing. If you think that, okay, I'm just gonna play a little harder, sure, you can play through the noise gate, play a bit harder, but on the other hand, you lose everything like a responsive control over the softer parts of everything. If you instead keep this on 0, the software is going to let everything through, also your mistakes. But those are your mistakes to actually learn to not do. I wouldn't use this at all, since I can't predict what notes will be cut out of my input process in any sensible way. Of course, I would use it if the signal chain is in any way compromised and I say I have a ground hum coming in that I can remove with the noise gate. I would actually move it up as much as to remove that particular interference. The next thing that you'll have is the MIDI Velocity window here. This is the other 3 buttons you have with regard to this. Okay, so before we go into what these 3 buttons in the MIDI Velocity box actually means and how to view these lines as a help for our sort of MIDI velocity shaping activities, let's do a signal chain overview. Here audio, here it's turned into MIDI, and here it is already MIDI, and you can do something about the dynamic part of it. All these lines represent the different notes that you can generate from the tracker here. So if we go into what these 3 mean, the gain is pretty obvious. This is a MIDI velocity box, so this is post conversion already. So this is applied to the already converted MIDI data, so it's velocity gain, of course. The tone is a sculpting tool in my book, so if you're using it like this I would use with an instrument that's very weak in the bass, or an instrument that I want most out of in the lower register, and perhaps I want it to react. You see that I can strike really hard without anything happening in the higher register. So if I do the opposite will be true, of course. I can't get any action. So view the tone button as a sculpting tool for the MIDI velocity and nothing else. The name curve can be confusing, I guess, so I would view this as the 0 position, the starting position, and to the right you have sort of a MIDI compressor. Equalize everything and put it to the middle, so you won't have any big differences in the output. Everything sounds dynamically kind of equal. The opposite would be true for me turning this counterclockwise. This is now an expander, so every sort of dynamic difference I had before is now exaggerated with as much as it was compressed by the compressor. So I keep this at 12 o'clock for most of my instruments. This is, to begin with, everything that you need to know about the settings that relates to how your instrument will work in MIDI Guitar. So moving into the tracking chapter, you have a great place to go for any information on MIDI Guitar, and that's the forum. Many questions are answered in the forum format, and you also have the help section in the actual MIDI Guitar software. Let's start with the help section, tracking issues header here. If you experience problems with tracking quality, here are some things to check. Make sure there are no yellow warning icons visible in the user interface for audio device settings or CPU meters. We have an internal warning system built into the software that tells us if and when we have some settings that are really out of whack, so we shouldn't really do those. The second point here is make sure MIDI guitar receives a clean guitar signal. This, I think, is really important. I've been talking about signal chains for a while, and we're often talking about what kind of guitar you should use, that you should be aware that your cables should be okay at least. Stuff like ground, hum, and different sort of interference where the signal comes from your guitar into the audio interface, into the computer, etc. And of course you should see to that your guitar is in tune, because the software is tuned to listen to stuff like that. They say, okay, use your bridge pickup and set the guitar tone control to high. This has been a recurring sort of suggestion from their side. Always use the bridge pickup, always use the volume and the tone knobs on full. Tracking should be viewed from the perspective, how great is this software at converting whatever we put into it into a reasonable output of, in this case, MIDI. It shouldn't always be a question of how fast is it converting, even if that's a relevant question as well, but it shouldn't always be a question about that, because if it doesn't track stuff like slides or bends really well, wouldn't you agree that it's perhaps not the best kind of trackers for a MIDI guitar software? I'm gonna do some sort of impromptu concerto here. If this software is something like a good software, it will allow me to actually be expressive with my instrument. You can also see if it seems to follow what I'm saying with regard to some of the other expressions other than just being fast. So in this case, I just tried some slides, I tried some pre-bends and stuff like this, and the software tracked almost everything perfectly. I made one blunder in the middle, and that's my mistake. But aside from that, the tracking is really something else with this software, if you allow it. So of course I have to practice all of these instruments and I have to know how they work, and some instruments work better than other, but the tracking in and of itself in the software, I don't know anything that rivals it. And I've played with some other pickup systems and I've played some other setups, but nothing feels this organic. Okay, so a subject that I haven't talked about is sympathetic resonance, and that's the idea that perhaps you're playing some melody lines, and the strings that you're not using are starting to vibrate as you're playing. You need to have a plan to deal with that, because otherwise those interferences are also going to go into the audio interface, of course, and being translated by the software. And this could be a cause of extra notes if you're not careful. How do you handle that stuff? Myself, I used a fret wrap to begin with. This was my first way of handling this stuff. After that time, I developed a new playing style where I employed hybrid picking and a style where I come in from above, picking upwards, so I don't sort of rake over the strings that much. If I always use this hybrid picking style, I'm more in control of every note's start and stop. And the stopping of the notes is one of those most important things I've learned in the last year, I would say. I read the syntax manual and I saw that they had a similar solution to this problem. And that's really you start a note with your right hand. Then afterwards, stop the note by just sort of lifting your fingers from the fretboard, muting the string with the same fretting hand. And do that for... If you do this in practice, I'm sure you're gonna get better results. If you're serious about using MIDI guitar, but still have problems with the sympathetic resonance and all those extra notes that we all know comes when you try to play bigger chords, this is a great way to get past that. Try to, in the beginning, not use your right hand as a damper. Obviously, you shouldn't use the damper here as well if you just try to learn how to do this. This idea is to leave a little space between every note so that you have consciously stopped the note when going to the next. This is, I think, the best way to improve your MIDI guitar game. So this is the last part of this video, and it's on the latency part. We've already gone over choosing the fastest option possible. That would be 1 millisecond according to that setting. But you must not forget that latency is much more than that. I mean, you have the latency of the signal coming into the computer and all that. So that projected 1 millisecond, you're not going to reach anything near that. The round trip latency, I would assume, is something around 20 milliseconds overall when you actually play and listen back to what you're getting out of the speakers. Of course, you have latency both ways. You have latency going into the audio interface and then coming to the MIDI software, triggering some synths, of course, and out via the audio interface into the speakers, and from the speakers to you. You obviously are going to have some sort of distance as well. So overall, you'll have something like 20 milliseconds. And the only thing you can do is actually to learn to play with those milliseconds of delay. It shouldn't be a problem actually to perform anticipating your moves by 20 milliseconds. If I go into, say, the Brighton Sound System's audio delay calculator for live sound, and what would 20 milliseconds be in meters? They say it's somewhere around 7 meters. And the question would be, do you think that you would have a hard time playing, say, in a rehearsal studio, standing 7 meters away from your amp? 20 milliseconds isn't really that much. Get yourself a great audio interface. Practice playing with the output only to a beat. Rid yourself of the idea that it is possible to get down to a zero latency system. As Paul Driesen says in the forum, every pitch to MIDI solution has a latency. It's caused by the wavelengths involved, and it's not possible to build such a system without latency. Jamoridian says here in the forum that use a low noise gate setting. Higher noise gate settings increase latency. So in conclusion, latency can be a problem, but it shouldn't be. Learn to play the output. Don't use any of the noise gate unless you really have to. Choose the lowest version for the latency alternatives in your software. And thank you for making it all the way here. This has been a long video, and I really hope that it's full of stuff that you can use if you're new to this, and even if you have some sort of experience but have been interested in what settings perhaps other people use. It could be of some interest even to you. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon in some other video on some other MIDI guitar related subjects.